So right now, we are doing what we are calling a flip panel. So I want everyone to start thinking about questions here, and I already have a couple that have started that were submitted during the registration process. But we're going to have the opportunity to hear from the STEM organizations, and you're going to have a chance to ask questions. And so they're going to talk a little bit about, hey, this is our organization, this is who I am, but we really want to hear from you. We want to know what's on your mind. What are you thinking about integrated STEM? What are you thinking even in terms of these robotic kits? What are you, do you have questions about the integrated STEM that's involved in all of this? So I'm going to invite up on stage, we have David Barnes. He is representing NCTM. And next we have David Evans from NSTA. Next we have Stacy from ASEE. And then we have Carol here from the Smithsonian. And last but not least, Steve from ITEEA.
Thanks.
So I'd like to begin with, I'm going to start over here with David. I'm just going to go ahead and have you introduce yourself, and then we'll just go right on down.
That's great. Hi, I'm Dave Barnes with the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and it's great to see so many of you out there that love mathematics. All right. That's good. You mean talk good enough, or you want a little more about NCTM?
You can give a little bit more, just quick over, because they haven't heard from you yet.
Okay, so NCTM. NCTM was a group that started standards back in 1989 and have been working to improve how teachers and students engage in learning and doing productive mathematics through their K-12 careers.
My name is David Evans. I had a chance to talk to you guys yesterday in a couple of venues. I'm the executive director at the National Science Teaching Association, and I like to think of myself as a STEM poster child because my undergraduate degree was actually in mathematics. So it can happen.
Hi, I'm Stacy Klein, Gardner from American Society for Engineering Education, and you met me this morning, so good to see you again.
Hi, my name's Carol O'Donnell, and I'm the director of the Smithsonian's Science Education Center. How many have been to the Smithsonian?
Right.
All right. All right. We focus on supporting districts, state education agencies, and ministries of education throughout the globe to transform teaching and learning using science.
And I'm Steve Barbato, Executive Director and CEO of the International Technology and Engineering Educators Association, ITEEA. Our mission is to ensure that all children become technologically and engineering literate in that pre-K-12 space and supporting educators pre-K-12 and in higher education to deliver technology innovation, design, and engineering in a meaningful and contextual way.
Well, terrific. Well, good morning, and thank you all. We have two microphones that are in the back here. They're going to be, you don't have to just raise your hand. And we're going to start just by seeing what are some of the questions and what's on your mind. So we have a few questions here. Is there anyone that wants to start, or I'll go to my paper that I have? Anyone? Who wants to be the first? All right, we're going to give you a moment to start to think about those questions, but we're going to start with this first question that was submitted online, and that talks about what are some of the challenges in regards to that you feel teachers have or educators have related to integrated STEM. And I think what we'll do is we'll start, I'll start kind of down at the end here, and we'll work our way this way, but then I'm going to mix it up after that.
Okay.
Cool.
So I think in mathematics, one of the things that I see as a challenge, that we see as a challenge, is that there's a sense that we have this sort of standard curriculum, and there's so much in there that we need to get done. And teachers feel that pressure to sort of just continue. I don't have enough time. And really the challenge is, and it connects to what was said yesterday about how do we create moments where kids are like, wow, right? That they get engaged. And I would say that that's actually really important for teachers and for kids. That kids believe that I can do mathematics, and I can make sense of this, and I can make these pieces, and I can contribute, and I'm a mathematician. I can think like that, I can do that. And so it is really carving out those opportunities in the course of the year and building on them so that we create a whole generation of people that say, I love math, I can do math, or I'm just good at math, I like math, versus probably what we have more of the opposite today.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for integrated STEM is in the integrated word, actually. As teachers, as educators, we are really good at helping children become good students. And we bring with us a definition of students from our own history of being students. And we were taught math and chemistry and biology, and if we were lucky, earth science and social studies and how to write. And our view of what it means to be a student is carved up into those little individual compartments. I think Stephen talked about that a little bit yesterday. And so the real change that needs to take place in being successful with this idea of integrated STEM is working on the culture that helps teachers and students and their parents understand that what we really want to do is educate students to be able to solve problems, to make decisions, to have the tools that they will need in an environment that's really changing, and that the boundaries that we have arbitrarily set up and which we really cling to, honestly, are boundaries that have got a historical background, but have very little to do with the way we actually need to function in the world now. So, you know, I would think that for many teachers in many schools, one of the most important things is probably to provide them with a little bit of time, so that they actually have time to talk to the social studies teacher or the English teacher or the math teacher, and there's an opportunity to, in a practical way, in a practical, this particular school setting, think seriously about what that integration means, not just for the purpose of preparing curricular materials, but for the purpose of understanding each other's point of view, so that some of those boundaries among the practitioners can be broken down as well.
Perhaps not surprisingly, I see engineering as the field that really links everything together within STEM, but there's a real fear factor around engineering. Our teacher preparation programs most of them still do not train teachers in what it means to do engineering or the engineering design process. So to me, that's one of the big challenges, is we're still recreating the same problem, if you will, of teachers who aren't confident and ready to use engineering and STEM as a whole in our classrooms.
Yeah, and I would say that, not surprisingly, Dave talked about math, you talked about engineering, I'll talk about science, probably David has talked about both. I think the challenge is that you'll talk about technology, probably.
And engineering.
And engineering.
Oh.
I think the problem with STEM is the fact that it seems to, an integrated STEM, is the fact that it leaves out these other things, some of which David mentioned. For the Smithsonian, we would say history, art, culture, literacy. And so the challenge is that STEM is not about the domains that make it up. STEM is really an advocacy term, and it's really promoting just good teaching and learning. And for us, I think the biggest challenge around STEM is that it's not about science, technology, engineering, and math. It's about what one of my board members would say, which is strategies that engage minds. And that's the focus, I think, of what we're just trying to promote. If you think about what we did this morning, it's about engaging our minds in solving problems, engineering solutions, thinking about the learning that underlies it. So, biggest challenge, thinking about each of those domains separately.
All right. So the challenge I have is, what area should I attack? Because there's so many challenges out there. After listening to these, they're all relevant and right on target. I think from my perspective, I'd like to focus on the pre-K-12 delivery and the educators that sit in that space. When we break it down, I'll ask this. How many of you are high school teachers? High school. Okay, how many of your 9th and 10th graders can measure effectively and consistently to a 32nd of an inch? Right? Yeah, exactly. Now, do you think measurement was taught in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade? Absolutely. The problem is they haven't practiced it over time in a variety of contexts to really feel comfortable, confident, and competent in it. And we have to provide those experiences on an ongoing basis in a contextual way for us to meet those challenges. But here's what happens. We go pre-K. Where does it start? How does it happen? We need to support and provide examples of that. When it gets to K1, 2, in early elementary, we need to start building on what they learned in pre-K and then move it forward to 3, 4, and 5, and so forth to middle school and the high school in a progression that's meaningful. And we need to do that in a way that connects the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, hence this process with integrated STEM education or integrative STEM education. So as we're moving forward, I think one of the biggest challenges is to be reflective in your teaching. Try to think, where was it that those students learned different areas of the science and the math and connect it to that technology and engineering that's happening in that contextual way with the hands-on activities like you're experiencing right now with the colonization of Mars.
Terrific, thank you. So, are there questions now from the audience that we've started to think about this? And even with these robotic kits and what you were doing today, what have been some of the challenges that you've been facing as you've been thinking about this colonization of Mars? So let's hear from someone here.
Hi, I'm Maku Etta from the city of Newark, New Jersey, and we are a STEAM ecosystem, right? So we're here with some of our other ecosystem partners. So the arts integration piece into these very tech, science, math conversations is really important. A lot of our funders, a lot of our schools, our school system is very focused on that. So I'm really trying to get a sense of, when you speak about other components really in this STEM conversation, can you just give an example of how that kind of lives out in terms of some of your partnerships with a school or a community partner that's working on it on the ground? Some examples would be great on how, you know, the arts integration piece, the literacy piece really kind of folds into this larger conversation. And how do you, and for everyone, how do you work with an intermediate, like how do you work with a group of an intermediary that's working with schools? I would love to share this with some of our school partners, our community partners, and I just want to understand what's your relationship with these entities within the city.
So Carol, I think we'll start with you and then kind of spread it out to the other associations.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for the question, because I think it's important. You know, some of the signs that you see outside, people wrote STEM, but the hyphen or / STEAM, because we don't know what to say. I think it's one of the biggest challenges with the acronym of STEM is that when each of us on this floor or this panel, as well as each of you, your definition will differ. And we can't ignore the fact that the arts, history and culture, social emotional learning, civic engagement, it all exists. And when we engage youth and their educators, we have to think about it more holistically. I think that's why many of you, when I've spoken with you, you've talked about problem-based learning or project-based learning, place-based learning, because the world, as I think you've mentioned many times, doesn't disaggregate these topics into separate. So an example for, in terms of art integration, the Smithsonian Institution has the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, so the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. And STEM is really all fully integrated into what they do, but they are technically an art and design museum. So I'll give you an example of a way a first grade teacher might integrate art into a science classroom, which is also engineering solutions to problems and having students code. So first grade teacher in their science class wants to teach about sound, but they have the students designing kazoos in order to study that vibrations cause sound. So they design these kazoos, they test the fact that different lengths of the tube actually have an impact on the sound. And then what they do is they listen to some of the Smithsonian folk waves music that was created with kazoo sounds. They design banjos, test rubber band length, recognize that the length of the rubber band, the tension actually makes a difference in terms of the sound. And then they listen to banjo music. So there are different ways that students and teachers, especially in elementary school where you have, having been an elementary school teacher for a decade, we have a little bit more freedom to be able to integrate arts and literacy. And then the teacher, go back to this first grade teacher again, now has the students read about the Smithsonian's National Museum of American Indian Native American drums and how the different size of the drums and the tension actually makes a difference in the type of sound that's created. So that's a good example of integration of all of these domains into one. And that's why I think we have to be careful, because STEM, it's hard to know when to stop. I mean, how many of you have heard of STREAM, right? Because people care about reading. Or hamster, history, art, math, science, okay? So it's difficult, and I think art integration obviously is crucial, so it's a good question. I know you asked the second question about how we interface with communities, and it's really working directly with you or a community member, and maybe it's a BOCES in New York who's an intermediary, and it's finding out what the needs of the region are and addressing and supporting that district or region with the help of an intermediary. Because if one of us leaves, the work has to continue. And so that makes a huge difference to work with someone in the region who understands the community well.
Stacy?
I'd love to jump in too. So in ASEE, we talk a lot about when you're doing engineering, you're not doing it in isolation. You're doing it to solve human needs and wants. And so that there implies that there's a client, there's someone for whom you're doing the work that you're doing in an engineering classroom. So, or in any classroom. I think everything's an engineering classroom. But in that case, you don't have the chance, or you don't leave out arts or history or geography. You have to understand all of that in order to understand your client more fully. And so I like for teachers to recognize that, and that's a natural part of what engineers do. And therefore, I don't leave out any of the letters. I call it STEM for convenience, but all of the letters to me matter in that regard. And to give you some examples, so I live in Nashville, which, we do music in Nashville, you might have heard. And you can do, like the Country Music Hall of Fame and Hat Show Prints are very involved in doing activities actually even similar to what you were talking about. Coming up later this month, I'm partnering with Cheekwood Botanical Gardens. And we're doing one of the Engineering as Elementary's hand pollinators unit for first and second graders. And we're going to take our teachers to the botanical gardens and see how they do pollination for real. And so that's a really nice partnership, and it comes from taking the time to get to know the different leaders and putting yourself out there. I think sometimes that's one of the things that we struggle with is schools have needs and we have people who want to help, but doing the matchmaking is something that is more challenging and takes longevity in a community to make that come together.
Go ahead, David.
So at NSTA, we work a lot with intermediary organizations. They're mostly the out-of-school provider community. Museums, zoos, after-school programs, to figure out how do you get sort of mutual benefit out of the different kinds of environment for learning any of the STEM subjects. We a couple of years ago started an experimental program with a journal that's focused on STEM education. It's focused on it in the way of trying to provide a venue for educators in the quote K-12 community and educators in the out-of-school community to have a common place where they can share experiences. So it's not a research-based journal, it's a journal of practice like the other NSTA journals. And And so being able to provide a facility for that to happen is important. The other thing that's important, and I'll just put my, the science hat on for a second, is that we've had real challenges in the last 16, 17 years in getting time to teach science or any of the STEM subjects, with the exception of math, in elementary school in particular. And so we've had a strategic approach that basically says, let's talk to the literacy folks. And one of the most successful programs we have is a program called Picture Perfect Science, where elementary school teachers have the opportunity to teach science and get the support they need to teach that science through using children's trade books. And so trying to find the keys of the people who are playing and the organizations that offer the range of activities is, I think, a way that speaks strongly to integration and sort of sets a tone for how to follow through. My own sort of fantasy curricular answer to that question would be, I would love to see a really meaningful collaboration between folks developing climate change science information on the one hand and working with the social studies teacher, so that there could be a really clear understanding of the science that we understand about the way the world works on the one hand, and then being able to use that understanding to have a conversation about, well, what should we do? And so taking advantage of the specific characteristics that give rise to those disciplinary ideas, but putting them together in a way that equips students to deal with issues that are important in their world, I think is one way that we try and approach that.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump to Steve next.
All righty, thanks. So at ITEEA, we have on our resources area of our website a definition of integrative STEM education. And it talks about the natural intersection of all the disciplines through the context of teaching technology and engineering with the appropriate math and science interwoven. So that natural intersection of all the disciplines really tells us and supports what we've heard from our other panelists of all the different disciplines being addressed in the right context at the right time. Way back in the day when middle schools became middle schools from junior highs, there was that whole open classroom interdisciplinary approach. And the one key to that, for those of you that can remember it, was it had to do with the people delivering it. They had to communicate, and communication is the key, which leads right into the second part of your question, I think, or the second question, and that is, how do you work with an intermediary and reach out into the community and have them work back and forth? And I think communication is the key. So if there's an arts kind of real focus in a community, which most communities have in different ways, it ought to be embraced, and there needs to be some open dialogue there. And possibly one thing that I found in my administrative experience at the public school system is not all the time do people feel comfortable coming to the school. So I think sometimes you have to hold the event there and take your folks out to that place. So I think those would be the things I would focus on in addressing that.
Thank you. All right, Dave.
So you talked about art and language arts. And one of the things that we really look at mathematics and are thinking about is sort of beauty and wonder. Do people see beauty and wonder in the mathematics? And I think that's one of the things that we can learn from the arts and build on that piece, that people see mathematics as something that's a human development, something we've created that's truly amazing. The other part is the language piece in this discourse. One of the things that we know is that students learn best when they talk about their thinking and they think about the thinking of others. And that we're really pushing to have more discourse and more discussion from students involved in that learning process. And so that we're always working to have kids make sense and help think about how other people are making sense, because there's not really one way to do it. It creates a richer experience. In terms of the partnership piece, I know that everybody in this room is working as hard as they can. And one of the things that we are looking for is trying to say, how do we find ways that we can actually collaborate, partner, and work harder together to make improvements? And so some of that is through projects where we do professional development in schools and districts, but we're open to looking for and thinking about how do we help and work to support these STEM and integrated STEM initiatives in the various places that you are.
And I just want to add, this is what the STEM Leadership Alliance Summit is about. It's about starting to think about integrated STEM, not just as a 4-letter acronym, but really having this meaning that goes across all disciplines. And part of this too, and I think it was said so well yesterday, when we think about the International Space Station, the part that just strikes me and is this fact that you have all of these countries up there. They speak different languages, they have different cultures, but how they work together. And they're not working in silos. They're not saying because you have the science background, now you go to that part of the shuttle, and now you have the math background and you go to that part. They're working together. And that's what this is about. And I think if we can take what all of these wonderful individuals are doing, and we start to put it into a place that it becomes about true integration, then our students are going to have magic happen. Because they're not going to say to us, I don't understand this, why am I doing this? Or I don't like math, or I'm not good at math, or I don't really understand, you know, engineering is just a project and technology is my Chromebook, and oh, I don't have science this year. Instead, what it's really going to be about is that every day they're seeing the world in a very different way. And that it becomes the big thing is that they start to look at the world to say, how do I use what happened in the past, that history? I learn what I'm learning across all of my disciplines, and I start looking at my community to say, what are the problems that I can solve? How can I be the next inventor, creator? And so that's what I think this is about today. So I want to go back to you, because I think they articulated that so well, but I want to go back and ask, what other questions do you have? And how do we help bring this back to your local community and where you are, that you really start to push to say, I'm going to work with my colleagues, with others in the community, and it's all about, it takes a person to kind of bring those groups together to start that change process. So other thoughts and comments? Great.
First off, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. This is an awesome opportunity for me. So my name is Alan Wang. I am a science department chair at the KIPP Academy Lynn Collegiate School, so that's a charter school in Massachusetts. So when you were talking about STEAM, I think one of the really cool things I've noticed in my classroom, so I teach an introductory to engineering design class, and what I've noticed is some of our strongest students actually have this arts background, and they're coming in and doing things such as Autodesk Inventor and really embracing like this 3D design. And I think that's really cool because it really speaks to STEAM. One of the other issues that is really near and dear to my heart is equity in STEM. One of the things that we know is that you know, students who identify as Black or Latinx are underrepresented in the STEM fields. And in my work in particular, I'm very much, you know, sort of supporting that, right? As the KIPP network, you know, my organization, you know, we have this pipeline where we're trying to really push for K-12, you know, sort of STEM inclusionary education. Now, one of the things I've also noticed is, you know, when they go to college, right, the university level, STEM education looks quite different. And I think there's lots of reasons why. Now, my question is, when we're talking about STEM integration, and going and sort of making those connections, and you talk about partnerships, you talk about communities. What are you guys doing in terms of connecting that with like university levels? Like what kind of partnerships are there? And especially including, you know, with this idea of equity in mind as well.
Thank you for that. And you've set this up beautifully for our next panel, which is going to talk about this equity in STEM. But I think it's also a great way to hear from your level to kind of start and to open that up. So I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. Great question. And I'm going to give you one example, but I'm sure there's a ton of others. So at ITEEA, we're trying to really focus on what can we provide teacher preparation institutions, teacher educators, on how to help elementary, middle, and high school teachers really understand how to integrate appropriately and teach the content, skills, assessments with resources about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So for our curriculum that we have available, Engineering by Design, through our STEM Center for Teaching and Learning, we've offered any higher ed institution professor the ability to download and share and use and create classes with their students to explore and do any of the different activities, units, and courses online. And with that, we have monthly, bi-monthly professional development, we call them seminars, to help teachers better understand those different courses as well as all the extra pieces that go along with it in terms of professional development. So there's also then a combination of that pre-service with in-service and connecting it. So you have the undergraduate and the graduate working together. So it's providing resources like that that I think we can start to nip away at providing solutions at that higher ed level to make a difference in what the teachers know and are able to do as they enter their teaching career.
Yeah.
And I do apologize, I don't have a Susan, like Mike kept saying Susan, but I just wanted to have the clock going so I knew how much time we had. So I'm going to pass that right along there. So you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Go ahead, Carol.
So first of all, I think the question is a really important one, and I agree, sets up the panel well. Later on today, I'm actually going to be leading a workshop about when we think about the integration of STEM, we also have to think about the integration of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Those terms, while seemingly another acronym, DEAI, that we're going to have to think about, that's important. That idea of integrating diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion are critical because equity means one thing, diversity means another, inclusion another, accessibility. And you often can't think about one without the other. And so I think that many universities who are doing a lot of research in the area of diversity in the STEM fields, but also focusing on equity, inclusion, and accessibility, universities often become important partners. The Smithsonian Science Education Center works directly with minority-serving institutions, historically black colleges, universities throughout the nation and have impacted up to 66 school districts to date to try to address the question you're raising around equity and diversity. Most importantly, because the teaching profession the STEM teaching profession does not look like the student population. And as a result, you can't just work with school districts to solve that problem. You have to also work with teacher preparation programs to make certain that they're preparing teachers to then go off to school districts to work. So I think that idea of equity is critical, but we also have to think about it in the context of these other terms.
I'm going to go down to Dave, because Stacy, I want to kind of use you at the end because of ASEE. So go ahead, Dave.
Okay. Access, equity, empowerment, identity, there are a huge range of challenges in that area, especially in mathematics. And as you think about transition sort of from high school to college, we've actually focused on some things at high school because we know that high school's not serving many of our kids well. And thinking about what are the policies and practices and procedures that need to change even within our high schools to better prepare and increase opportunities for each and every kid. So that's one of the things that I think is useful. We have a book called Catalyzing Change in High School Mathematics that basically says this isn't a problem just with math teachers, but it takes a lot of us to be involved that include both leaders and administrators at the high school level, as well as work on transition to college. And the other piece is about active learning. If we're engaging with kids in active learning at high school, then they go to college and something's different, and it's not active learning, then they're at a disadvantage. And what we're seeing is that, in fact, there's a movement at higher ed to do mathematics in more of an active learning model. Uri Treisman has a program on transition, and some of that work, so you might look at those pieces, but that universities understand that we need to do a better job of serving and supporting students as they move and not putting them into these cycles of remediation, but actually stacking courses so the kids get just in time what they need to be successful. And the data is incredible in terms of students getting back on track and not getting behind and catching up with what they're doing.
David Evans?
Sure. So I think you raised a really great question, and it's one that sometimes we don't put enough thought behind or enough effort into, I think. And that's this transition question, even going from, as in your case, a STEM-focused school. The culture in higher ed is different. If you think in using, as I mentioned yesterday, using the new science standards sort of as a model or framework around which one might build or think about a STEM program, first of all, there are very few STEM programs identified that way at the university level. But more importantly, that university community is one that has not been particularly responsive to the new standards. We're still bringing new teachers out of their teacher preparation programs without hearing very much about STEM. In fact, without hearing very much about the new science standards, because if you sort of take a look at the stack going from K through the university level, the further along you go, the more conservative the process gets. There's no one who's more certain about or more confident about his teaching style than a tenured university professor in a science, let's say. And I'll just give you one little anecdote that sort of highlights the problem. I mean, many of you have probably, can probably recall, sitting in your freshman physics class or chemistry class with 250 of your best friends, or soon-to-be best friends, and having the professor announce in his opening lecture to take a look around and realize that a third of you won't be here at the end of the semester, and another third of you will be gone at the end of the second semester. I see a head nodding over here. And the problem is not so much with that statement, which you could take as a data statement, but the problem is that that professor was proud of it, because he thought his job was to weed people out. And we have a culture in most of the STEM area subjects, and I don't mean this in the integrated sense, I mean this, science and technology and engineering and math, that traditionally has viewed itself as a culture of just finding the best students and providing them with the best. And what we're actually trying to change now is to provide capability and confidence in all of those STEM areas in an integrated way so that you can actually solve real problems. So that there's a huge culture change, a bigger culture gap, I think, between high school and higher education than we have really put much effort on. We focused on the K-12 world, and we need to. I'm not trying to make a mistake, trying to say that that's wrong, but in fact, we really need to work more closely with that higher ed community. We need to work with programs of teacher preparation. And there are things that we can do. At NSTA, we work with about 100 different teacher preparation programs, who use the online resources at NSTA as the textbook for science methods. And to the extent that we can influence the pieces that go in there, we finally have a lever to move the kinds of things that new science teachers are going to experience. So moving them into the next generation standards is one part of it. Subsequently, moving them into a broader perspective, looking at STEM education in a more integrated way, I think is someplace that we have to go. But we still have to move a little bit further from our own comfort zone and deal with that chemistry professor or that physics professor or, alas, that math professor, who many of whom, not all certainly, but many of whom still have this kind of traditional role that they're the filters as opposed to the enablers. And so there are real challenges there, and I think we need to pay explicit attention to it.
Thank you. So Stacy, before you answer that question, I'm going to add another piece to this, because you talk about K-12, or we're talking about high school and moving on to that college and university piece. But I also think there's an issue around defining STEM, because if you think about what corporations and business want, they say they want more STEM degrees. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow, but I think it's interesting because colleges and universities kind of are wedged in this middle piece. And so we say that we need more STEM skilled. So then you have colleges and universities say, absolutely, we need more in the STEM pipeline. And then we go back to the K-12 system and we're trying to build up that STEM pipeline. But there's a disconnect that's happening there. And so I'd love for you to talk about it, one, from that high school, building it on to the college and university, but I also think it's coming back down to saying, how do you prepare the workforce? And also going back to, I think, what Stephen Pruitt talked about yesterday around this communication piece, is that we're struggling, and why he put those points in there is because we have a difficult time articulating to each other what are those STEM needs, and so how can anyone really efficiently and effectively start to develop this pipeline and develop our needs if we're really not sure what we're talking about altogether? So I know I'm putting a lot of pressure on you. So I'm going to give the $1 million question and pass it over to you to say, you know, how do you kind of play in that middle? And also, you know, and again, I'm not saying that college is that track for all, but I think in this context here, I think it's just kind of how do we get the appropriate players to all really think about this in the right context.
Okay, a lot to go on there. So I feel like, first of all, I'm lucky because I was one of those people who heard exactly what you were saying. It was look to your left, look to your right. And I was lucky that I saw myself still sitting there. I wasn't the one that didn't see myself as a member of the engineering community. And I've been lucky to have both role models and mentors along the way. So I think it's important for us to recognize the value of both role models, people who look like you, and mentors can be anyone. I've had a lot of wonderful men who have helped me through my career in being an engineer. So I'll mention that first. And I think we have kind of two aspects to this problem, this challenge that we're thinking about. One is sort of, to me, is a STEM literacy. And having the ability to solve problems and think about the real world from a scientific standpoint and a problem-solving standpoint. We want that for all of our children. And then we also have the career issue, that we want more people, more and more diverse people to go into these fields. And so there are kind of two things at play, and I think we need to keep both of them at the forefront. I think maybe you'll be happy to know that the American Society for Engineering Education, we have far more collegiate members in our group than we do P12 members. And the two committees that the board of directors for ASEE has set up that are society-wide committees are, one is P12 and the other is the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So this is something that's being addressed with our engineering education professors. We run a lot of workshops and and we do research around how does that look in those classrooms. So we're really trying to get at this problem of getting rid of that professor saying, look to your left, look to your right, only one of you is going to be sitting there, and changing that, the way that we teach at the university level as well, and that it can be something that our university professors can learn a lot from their P12 counterparts. And so that's something I want to see happen more, and not this, we know all because we're professors and we know everything. When in fact, as a professor of engineering, you very likely took absolutely zero education classes and got zero training in how to teach. You teach like you were taught, unless you've really sought it out. So I think that's one of those things that we need to keep working on. And defining STEM, I think, is still an interesting thing to me. It's a place for, it's all inclusive. Everyone has their place in it. There's a role for all of our disciplines across the stage and beyond to come together about solving human needs and wants. So that's how I still tend to frame it, because you can't do that without understanding the culture or the geography. You can't. You have to be able to explain what it is you've done, and so a lot of those other those skill sets and careers come into that.
That's great. Other questions that we have out there? I might have to call on someone, so. Got one over in the corner here? Oh, great.
Hi. When I was in the 3rd grade, I had this really marvelous teacher. She came in with an armful of daffodils, and she said, this morning I was doing the breakfast dishes, and I said to my husband, my children, we were her children, would love these. And when she came in, we read Edna St. Vincent Millay, we painted the daffodils. She told us that for every bulb you plant, you get 1.6 flowers. So if you wanted 200 flowers, how many bulbs would you have to plant? And she brought little plastic knives for us to cut them up and look inside. It was amazing. I currently coach a 3rd grade teacher, and she has mandated curriculum. She has a pacing calendar that says she must be doing exactly what every other 3rd grade teacher is doing that day. She has mandated curriculum on which she has had 0 training in math and in science. Tell me, how can your organizations, or are your organizations, supporting committed, energetic young educators who are kind of forced into this little cage that we've created around education?
That was a great question, thank you. I'm gonna start, yes. I'm gonna start with David Barnes, because we had that math piece starting in there,
We
so
did.
let's go.
There was clearly a math piece in there. So there's a piece of this that I think is about leadership. And how do we make decisions about what happens in the classroom and what guidance do we give to our teachers? Because I think that it's the role of educational leaders to lead the education. Now, I'm gonna push back a little bit because I think there's an element of this that says it's not really fair to have a teacher lottery. That in fact, one kid gets a wonderful teacher that brings in daffodils and does this, and there's another teacher just next door with the same group of second grade students that is struggling to think about how to teach mathematics and how to gauge their kids. That we actually need to work so that we're doing exciting and engaging learning for students across all the students in second grade and all the students in third grade. And that's about professional collaboration. That's about finding time and making space to say, what's working for what we're doing? How do we improve it? What ideas do we have? Let's test these out. Let's talk about the results that we get back. And let's change what we're doing so that we are not making the teacher the unit of change, but the school and the district the unit of change to reach each and every kid. So what do we do as an organization? You know, we try to provide the resources and the support and the community because some people are out there in an island, right? And so we do have community activities where people could share and do that. But I also think that it is a need that we have, and we're working with this to engage leaders. And how do we build that structural and the rule process and infrastructure support so that teachers have that joy and support to reach every kid.
And even within that context, because I think the question with this mandates that schools and that teachers face, that schools face, that districts face, states face. So I'm going to add just one more piece of that I want you to still talk a little bit about,
okay,
is that in that realm of the mandates, right, how do you, because I think you're absolutely right, it's about teaching for all kids, and it shouldn't just be based on you have the one teacher here and the other teacher here, and they're just at different stages. But how do you also then, and what are the organizations doing to help think about those mandates that are being forced upon these educators and the time constraints? And if you're a teacher that's in the classroom there, how do you push the change to say, I've only got, my approximately 45 minutes for my period? So what are some of your thoughts, just, can you add a little bit of flavor to that?
I would argue that the place to start is data. And ask the question, is what we're doing working? Right? I mean, that's a leadership question to say, is this really a better way? Because somebody thinks it is. And one of the challenges that we make is sometimes we make decisions that are easier for the adults and not better for the kids. And so I think that's a place we have to start. And again, it's this idea of a larger discussion. It's not that we're blaming the classroom teacher, but collectively we need to think about what are our processes and practices and policies in the schools, and are these really the best ones that fit for our kids? And so that would be my perspective on sort of how we start to address that and think about that.
I'm going to jump to Stacy.
I think that the thoughts that have come to mind with your question are that it is challenging. I think it is a leadership question, but if we're going to have things like pacing guides or testing, they need to be pacing guides or testing that I want to teach too. They need to be, so if we have to have them, how do we affect change to make those better? Because I think we've taken a lot of the art of teaching away from being a teacher and made them more into the sage on the stage or the robot that's implementing what is coming down from on high. So I think I would challenge us as the organizations that do have a voice as to how do we affect change there?
I'm I'm actually going to go to David Evans. I'm going to use you.
Yeah. So first off, let me just react to the question, because you hear a question like that, and honestly, it just breaks my heart. And I think we probably all have stories that are similar to the one that you just said. I had an elementary school teacher a couple of years ago at a meeting like this, sitting around a table, and I was chatting with them and asking them basically, how much time do you get to teach science? Do you teach science? And this one teacher said, well, yeah, I do teach science, but last spring when my principal did my annual review, he apologized for giving me a lower rating than I had in previous years, and the reason that he gave for the lower rating was that he caught me teaching science. And unfortunately, it's not the only case of that, and it speaks exactly to your question. I think Dave nailed it really right on. I think it's a leadership question. The next step beyond that scenario is we just take the human beings out of the room. I mean, why do you need a person standing there to, quote, teach in that fashion? What we know is that, beyond a student's family circumstances, the single most important thing in the student's education in any subject is the teacher. And if the teacher is following a prescribed script, I would argue that there's not much reason to have the teacher there. So we have to work on the leadership part. We need to work in the structural part of schools. We need to actually empower teachers to teach. The models that you might look at around other parts of the world where their success record might be a little better than ours all include those elements and exclude the elements that you're talking about. So that's sort of the political side. That's the leadership side. That's the persuading other folks, and this notion of holding teachers accountable in that kind of fashion, I think, is just antithetical to any notion that I have personally about education.
Carol?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The Smithsonian Institution, of course, doesn't engage in policy making or lobbying or any kind of promotion of a particular idea. But we do, so we're not able to affect change at a state education level or a district level in terms of guidelines like standards or curriculum. But I do want to just make one comment that doesn't answer your question, but goes back to your story. And this is really important. Think about that story you're telling today happened to you. How many years ago? I won't ask, but how many years ago? And a very long time ago, and you still remember it. And so I think it goes to Dave's point. When we talk about whether or not what we're doing is working, to me, that's evidence that what that teacher did worked. You may not have necessarily passed a standardized test question because of that action, but you remember that activity X number of years later because you were actively engaged in something that was truly integrating literacy, art, science, place-based learning because it was real to you. And that is, I think, the purpose of this conference. And it's also the reason why active, hands-on engagement, like what we experienced this morning, is so crucial, because we will remember that event, that experience years later, and that's true learning. So it doesn't answer your question, but I love the story for that very reason. Steve.
So I was going down a whole nother route to address this question until this last little piece. So I'm going to switch off and hit a follow-up to that I think will address the question. So in school systems that are very small, single entities, small districts, a couple elementary schools, one middle school, one high school, anecdotally, my observation is you do not see those hard, across the board, everybody at the same spot at the same time kinds of pacing schedules. Where you see them is in the larger systems where you have possibly 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more elementary schools, several middle schools, and several high schools. And then all of a sudden, they're trying to get this quote-unquote equity of delivery across the board. However, in teaching, it's not a manufacturing assembly line, as you well know. And that has to change, and that's done with leadership. So based on that, if we look at the NAEP TEL assessment, Technology and Engineering Literacy Assessment, and you combine that with a project that we did for about 5 years, it's a research project called Learn Better by Doing project, you'll see that the research demonstrates, especially in the 2018 results from the NAEP TEL assessment, that students that had that ability to have experiences exactly like she had in 3rd grade helped them better with that testing that's taking place in that NAEP assessment. In addition, they feel more confident to do more and greater, I'm losing the verbs, rigor. They take on those more rigorous challenges. So that's what the research is showing. And then the other part that I was going to share in trying to connect this is, it is a leadership issue, and good building leaders need coaching, need support on how they can help teachers keep their professional, artistic ability for teaching and engaging and sparking children. The pacing schedule and that curriculum across the board should only be the standard benchmark. It shouldn't be the end-all. I shared yesterday with the group that we were presenting with that I'm a big supporter of having a shared curriculum map at each of the grade levels in elementary, each of the content areas at the secondary level, so that teachers can share their expertise of these memorable moments that are being created that go above and beyond that natural pacing schedule. And that leadership part comes from that building principle for sure, and those coaches that they work with. And that's where we need to spend a lot of our time, helping them support that, and then getting that word out to the communities, because some parents will start to beat down on them if they're seeing one child not getting something that another child is. So they need that support.
Yeah. Well said.
Thank you. Well, we're almost at time, so I just want to leave this last part for some closing comments and thoughts. And I'd love to frame it around, we have a variety of shareholders that are in the room here. We have teacher leaders, we have principals, we have out-of-school providers, we have colleges and universities, we have business leaders and state leaders. And I'd love just, you know, as we think about this integrated STEM, what are the words that you would have to kind of challenge them, and what do you think they could take away from all of this? And I'm going to start with you.
So the one piece that I would think about is sort of the 3rd bullet in there, in that thing. And so I would encourage you to read the handout and think about that, because it really is catalyzed our work together. But that is, and I phrase it as, increasing opportunities. How do we build and create experiences that ultimately increase the opportunities that each and every student has?
I think that the thing that we need to do with the kind of diversity that we have attending this conference is to recognize that in some ways the heavy lift is over. We have the tools in place, and what we need to do is provide support to actually act on the things that we have agreed upon. I think that if we act upon what we know about how to teach mathematics, about how to teach science, about how to take advantage of engineering design, how to integrate the work that we have with the arts, if we simply pay attention to the admittedly difficult job of providing the support to the schools and the districts to implement what we have already agreed upon, I think we'll go a long way. I think that we need to stop looking for the silver bullet. There isn't magic that a business can do. There isn't something particularly special that's going to solve the problem with that after-school program or that competition. We need to focus on the structures that we have in place, the fact that we've built the capability into them at this point to execute, and get on with the job of executing.
I would challenge us in our ecosystems that we've set up to make sure that we have all the voices at the table. I worry at times that guidance counselors aren't more trained in what it takes to be in the STEM fields. I feel like too many guidance counselors are pushing the same people that they've always pushed into these fields. And so I would like to see that piece added in and make sure that we're really growing who can access STEM.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, being from a massive informal institution like the Smithsonian, I would absolutely challenge all of us to understand what community resources exist that can allow you to bring STEM into the classroom using those community resources, including people, but also where might you be able to bring your students either virtually or physically in order to expand their world and to see STEM in everything that's around them. So this focus specifically on place-based learning.
2 comments. The first is, I think we need to embrace the students in the classrooms to become the ones that come up with the design challenges that they can extend and connect to their own learning and run with it. That's first. And the second comment comes down to, we need to be able to look at ourselves and celebrate those successes that make those memorable moments happen at every level. Sometimes teachers feel as though they're just getting pounded down, pounded down, pounded down. And I hear it all the time. And then they also say they're overwhelmed constantly. Yes, they are. We need to help them by celebrating their successes and sharing them.
Well, I want to thank all of you. This was an amazing panel, so let's give them a round of applause.